All right, man. Peace. So I'm still working my way through my DVR. I got a lot of stuff backed up here. So y'all gonna see a lot of videos, hopefully when I get time. Oh, and another thing, let me also mention this. I get emails sometimes with people saying that my videos are disappearing. Well, sometimes my videos do get blocked, but most of the time when you guys see a video appear and then it's not there anymore, it's because I upload all my videos on private. So sometimes for whatever reason, YouTube uploads it public when I don't want it public yet. Because what I do is I upload it on private and then I go over it and then I pick the right photo to add as the avatar photo. So that's why I put it on private when it was uploaded on public by mistake. So when you guys see that, that's the issue. All right. So anyway, this feature, this segment is a good little segment I saw on Richard Nixon. So obviously they're going to report on Richard Nixon. I'm going to chime in here and there.
Others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them.
And you would know because you were full of hate. All right. You were full of hate. This man's he's one of the most wicked presidents of the 20th century. And that's saying a lot. All right. This man was wicked as hell. But we're going to get into that as we go along.
And then you destroy yourself.
Yeah, and that's what happened. You destroyed yourself because of your hatred. This guy had so many people bumped off. This guy presided over so many assassinations. This guy presided over so many break-ins, and the one that took him down was one that he really didn't even preside over. Henry Kissinger presided over the Watergate break-in. All right, that quadruple agent Henry Kissinger, but that's neither here nor there.
That was Richard Nixon's parting advice to his staff moments before he left the White House for the last time.
That sign that he did right there, where he waved his hand, that's known as the Masonic Dugard sign. All right. He was already aware that he was going to be removed. Richard Nixon wanted to be the president through two terms from 68 to 76. He wanted to be the president in 76 because he wanted to be the president that presided over the official, quote unquote, so-called New World Order. All right. 76 was going to be the bicentennial of the official start of America, quote unquote, along with the official start of the so-called Illuminati under Adam Weishaupt, May 1st, 1776. He wanted to be the president on May 1st, 1976. All right. But it was not meant to be. It was not meant to be because they had other plans. And that basically is that.
As the president of the United States, it's been almost 43 years since his historic resignation.
And while Mr. Nixon's time in office may have ended in shame, a new book argues he had an outsized influence on our world today. Richard Nixon, The Life, is being praised as a definitive biography of the nation's 37th president, when we're pleased to be joined by its author, John A. Farrell. John, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Anytime.
Let's start with a president taking a trip to Saudi Arabia in the middle of a crisis.
See, once again, the liberal media, they're going to try to link up a very controversial presidency with Richard Nixon and try to associate that or align that with Donald Trump because they're upset with Trump. All right. This is why, once again, this is how you know that Trump is against the he's against the Federal Reserve, and he might be at odds with certain factions of the international bankers. When you see the media constantly coming against a guy, that's why that is. All right.
Do you think there are any analogies?
Which Richard Nixon, in fact, did in 1974.
He did. In the summer of 1974, he took off. He did several foreign policy trips. He had one of his last summits with Soviet leaders. And basically,
Richard Nixon was a friend to the Soviet Union. All right. And this is in the midst of the so-called Cold War, which is nothing but an international bank fake confrontation between the Western powers and the so-called communist powers. All that stuff was contrived. Richard Nixon was a plant of the socialist movement. He got his start under Prescott Bush. For those of you who don't know, Prescott Bush was a senator during the early to mid part of the 20th century. He's also the father of George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the father of George W. Bush. All right. He's part of the Bush. He was part of the Bush cartel. The Bushes go back not just to Prescott Bush, but they go way, 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 way back. talking into the 1600s in regards to their influence. All right.
He did it for good reasons, but also as part of a distraction.
And I'll probably do a video on the Bushes later on. But when you get into the Bushes, then you also have to address the Nazis and things of that nature, which also will have to be addressed with Richard Nixon. But the Bushes were knee deep in with the Nazis. But let's get back to the topic at hand.
And it didn't work.
It didn't work.
It did not work. No.
He resigned a month later.
He resigned a month later. In 1972, he went to China. That was a big deal.
Yes, and the funny thing is, when he went to visit China, and I already covered the Chinese so-called communist revolution under Chu Enlai and Mao Zedong, they had just released a statement demonizing America and Richard Nixon right before he went there. But he went there once again because, like I said, Richard Nixon was a socialist plant. He was a friend to the communists. All right? He was a friend to the communists. They had an issue. The Russians or Soviets, they had an issue with their space program and also with their missile program, right? Their arms or their war department. They had an issue developing missiles. And in order for you to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, you have to have knowledge of ball bearings, because your ball bearing technology has to be accurate in order for your intercontinental ballistic missiles to be accurate. So anyway, the Russians tried to purchase a ball bearing machine from America back in the early 60s, and Kennedy turned them down. All right, because like I said in the Kennedy video, Kennedy was in over his head. Like he actually believed that there actually was an issue between America against the Soviet Union. Like he didn't understand the scope and the depth of what he was dealing with. All right. So he turned down the Soviet Union when they tried to make a large purchase of ball bearing machines, I believe from a corporation in Vermont, if I remember correctly. And in 1972, the Soviet Union tried to purchase ball bearing machines again. And Richard Nixon, of course, allowed them to purchase the machines. Now, mind you, this is in the midst of the so-called Cold War. All right. They tried to buy about 60 of these machines from Kennedy. Kennedy turned them down. It might have been 42 machines. I can't remember. He turned them down. And then when Richard Nixon comes along, they try to make the purchase again in 1972, and he allows it. All right. He sells them like well over 100 of these machines. All right. Contrary to what you've been taught in classical education or classical history, the Soviets were not ahead of America in any way, shape, or form technologically. They were helped by America. This is why I've stated in the past, all of the technology that these communist countries have, they get from America. All right. All this stuff about the Western powers versus the communist powers, that stuff is for TV. That's for you guys to believe in because it keeps the war machine going. All right. You have to have a large enemy in order to have a war machine. OK, when Mao Zedong and Chu Enlai and those communist premiers from China died, people like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, who were staunch communists behind closed doors, they were sad about it. That's why they made such laudatory comments about those men when they died, because they were helping them behind the scenes. All right. Chu Enlai was on record as stating that, when they were trying to figure out how China could afford to buy so much technology from America, Chu Enlai said, we can afford to buy, we can afford to buy this technology from America because we get the money to buy the equipment from America by growing opium and selling it to America. All right. Chu Enlai was on record as saying we grow the finest opium in the world to sell to America. That's where all the heroin was coming from, or a lot of the heroin that was flooding America in the late 70s, early 80s. It was coming from China. All right. China was growing the opium, selling the heroin to America, and the money that they got, they used to buy a lot of the arms and a lot of the weapons that they had during that time period. All right.
Signed a SALT treaty with the Soviet Union. That was a big deal, and that influenced people before they went to the polls in 1972. But I can't foresee that President Trump will bring anything like that back from this trip.
Well, John, the parallels between what's going on in the Trump White House and what happened in the Nixon White House are almost eerie. Let's just start with this week.
Yeah,
the invocation of the word witch hunt to describe what the president feels is happening regarding the Russia investigation.
Right.
President Nixon used the same words. Where did the sense of grievance come from?
Sense of grievance in Nixon's case came from a very Dickensian childhood. He grew up, there's a picture in the book of the Yorba Linda where he grew up, and it looks like the Badlands of Oklahoma during the midst of the Dust Bowl days.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, Nixon, he grew up in a Quaker household. I can't remember exactly, but the household that he grew up in, he grew up poor. All right? And when he went and he joined the Navy, and when he got out of the Navy, he wanted to be a big wig. I think he had a background in law as well. And that's where he got his start in politics. The Bushes, Prescott Bush, actually put out an ad in the newspaper saying, we're looking for a politician that's despicable, that's basically not scared of doing the worst things possible. And Richard Nixon answered the ad. That's how Prescott Bush got in contact with Richard Nixon and took him under his wing. All right. Now, Richard Nixon was able to, I believe he became the congressman of California. I believe it was 1946 or 48. I can't remember which year it was. It was late 40s. And he beat a guy named Jerry Voorhees. Jerry Voorhees, his campaign was based around coming against the Federal Reserve. All right. So this guy Nixon, who came out of nowhere, nobody could figure out how he won. It was because he had financial backing from the Bushes, who were socialists. Once again, all of the top multi-billion dollar powers, the investment bankers, they're all socialists. All right, / communists. I said that before. They're communists on the forefront because what that is that's the ability to convince the regular people to give up your money to them and trust them with your money. All right. So they need to have politicians that are going to play out their agenda. Richard Nixon was that guy. All right. So the Bushes backed Nixon to beat Jerry Voorhees, who once again was anti-Federal Reserve. Nixon wins the congressional seat for California in the late 40s. I think it was 46. And all of a sudden, 1952, he gets put on the ticket with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was another member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He was another pawn for the international bankers. Now, Eisenhower, and I'll probably go deeper into this on another video. Eisenhower was the guy who, when George S. Patton, and I'll probably do something on him also. George S. Patton was the general that was in charge in World War II of sweeping across Europe. In the latter part of World War II, in Germany, Patton conquered two cities named Peenemünde and Nordhausen, if I remember correctly. Those were the two major cities where the Nazi scientists were stationed. And George S. Patton, when he conquered those cities, he reported back to Central Command. He's like, okay, what do you want us to do with these cities? Eisenhower decided to give those two cities away to the Russians. Why is that? Because once again, they were trying to help the Soviet Union catch up to the so-called Western powers. Because what they were trying to do was they were trying to convince the people in the West that communism was an advanced society so that they would be attracted to it. All right. Once again, they want everybody working on a commune giving up their money. That's where you get income tax from. Income tax is just a way to take all your money. That's all it is. All right. Income tax is one of the main points, one of the main touchstones of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. For those of y'all who've ever read it. All right. Deprivatize everything. Take your money. Income tax. Schools that are based in totally, declassing everything. They don't want any class system. All right. They want everybody mixed, because when you mix everything, that brings about confusion. All right. But anyway, get back to the point. Eisenhower directed George Patton to turn over those cities to the Soviets. The Soviets came and they took a lot of the Nazi scientists that were there, but well over 100 of them fled to America or into the arms of the American armed forces because they did not want to have to report to the Soviets. All right. One of those men was a man named Werner von Braun, who started the space program. And I'll probably do a video on NASA in the near future. All right. Point being is that there has been a link between Soviet empowerment and the American government for a long time. And Richard Nixon was well aware of that because he was a pawn of the socialists. All right. So he is put on the Eisenhower ticket. This is why they were linked up, because Eisenhower was a socialist, as was Richard Nixon. This is why Eisenhower, when he did come into power in the mid-50s, he attacked Joseph McCarthy. I mentioned McCarthy before. Joseph McCarthy was the man who they coined the term McCarthyism after him, because he's the one who said that there were well over 70, over 100 high-ranking officials in the American government and the American infrastructure who were communists and who were working with the Soviets, who were double agents. All right. And they demonized McCarthy in the mid-50s, and they got rid of him because they did not want him to out what was really going on. All right. All of these different beefs, capitalism versus socialism, all of that stuff is fake. That's media shit. All right. America has been a low-level socialist society for a long time. All right. That's why a lot of these wars, Korean War, Vietnam War, those things were planned out in the late 40s. All right. You had a man named Jim Forrestal. He was the first Secretary of Defense, I believe, under Truman. He stated that he was told by a former justice of the Supreme Court named Frank Murphy that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife were both pawns of the socialists and the international bankers. All right. Frank Murphy ended up dead in the hospital. All right. Now, Jim Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense, if I remember correctly, he went on to he started a lot of the work outing the communists that McCarthy carried on in the 50s. This is in the late 40s. You had a man named Jim Forrestal who was trying to dig up or root out a lot of the communists that were infesting the American government. What they did was they relieved him of his job. Truman did. And they made him report to Bethesda, Maryland, to the Naval Hospital there. For those of you who don't know, the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland is one of the main center points for the MK Ultra mind control program. All right. So they got Jim Forrestal there. And keep in mind, this is the man who was the Secretary of Defense, the first Secretary of Defense for the U.S. government. Now, Jim Forrestal was a Catholic. He was very close with his priest. The priest tried to visit Jim Forrestal numerous times in the hospital. The priest was on record as saying they would not allow him to visit Jim Forrestal. Jim Forrestal's brother called the hospital and said, "I want to come pick up my brother." They said, "No problem. We're about to release him." Don't you know, the day that Jim Forrestal's brother was about to go visit him at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, they told him, "Well, you can't come visit him because he just committed suicide." They claimed that Jim Forrestal jumped out of a window. All right. Why is that? Because he had information on scores of the upper crust of the American government as working as double agents with the Soviet government. All right. Now, Jim Forrestal inspired Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy also ended up at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland in the late 50s because he had an issue with hepatitis. He also ended up dead there, allegedly due to hepatitis. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. I bring that up because Richard Nixon, near the end of his life, not near the end of his life, near when he was about to be forced out of office as president, he had a leg problem. He had like a leg injury or leg problem. They asked him if he was going to go to the hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, the Naval Hospital, saying that he was a member of the U.S. Navy, former member. And he said, "No, I'm not going there because if I do go there, I won't come out alive." All right. So he obviously knew what happened to Jim Forrestal and Joseph McCarthy. And even though Richard Nixon was a pawn and a plant, he knew that they were done with him. All right. They removed him because they were done with him. And Richard Nixon, man, you know what? Let me let this guy keep talking.
His father was a abusive, emotionally abusive fella. His mother was very, very cold, and as Nixon famously said, never in my life did she ever tell me that she loved me. So that kind of grievance was sort of fueled then when he gets into the campaigns against the Kennedys and other Ivy League tops.
Yeah, he had an inferiority complex. When he went against the Kennedys, he hated John F. Kennedy. You know, they had debates in 1960 when they were both running for president. And one of the main talking points in the 1960 presidential debate was something called the missile gap. And it was based on, like I stated before, this fictitious narrative that the Russians were way ahead of America in regards to their missile technology, which, as I stated, they were not. They did not even have ball bearing technology to create to improve their intercontinental ballistic missile technology. They didn't even have that. All right. And Richard Nixon knew it. He knew it, but he had to go along with the sentiment of the missile gap that Kennedy was trying to push. That was a talking point of Kennedy, because Kennedy's basic point is that Eisenhower and Nixon allowed for the Soviets to have advancements in missile technology that America didn't have. So this is why he should be voted into the White House. Nixon had to go along with it, even though he knew it wasn't true, because they needed the American public to think that there was a missile gap and to make the Soviets look like the big bad wolf that had all this technology when they really didn't have it. All right. Plus, they wanted Kennedy to get into the White House in 1960 anyway. That was a favorite of Joseph Kennedy, who, like I said, was a bootlegger. All right. And I'll probably do a video more on the Kennedys later on. Joseph Kennedy was a bootlegger. He also was a banker, and he was in the White House. I believe he was involved as the Secretary of Treasury under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? Who was his buddy, if I remember correctly. If not, one of you brothers can correct me. Y'all could look it up and correct me. But I know that he was in the White House in in some capacity in one of the cabinets. I can't remember which one, no offhand. But yeah, John Kennedy was allowed to run for president. It really was supposed to be his older brother that Joseph Kennedy wanted to become president, but his older brother, John F. Kennedy's older brother, died in World War II. So they moved on down to the next one. That's what they do. They have their sons fight in these wars, or act like they're fighting in these wars, because it builds up their credibility when they later on run for president. That's why the Bushes do it. All right. Prescott Bush was in World War I. George H.W. Bush was in World War II. George W. Bush, he was in the military. They do that on purpose. All right. There's no bullets that touch them. Remember when John Kerry ran for president, they tried to act like he was this great war hero, and then come to find out it was all a lie. All right. They did a mock-up of that in that movie Manchurian Candidate with Denzel Washington back in 2004, the remake of the Frank Sinatra film, where they had what's the guy named Liev Schreiber. He basically played a John Kerry type of person. All right. Most of these politicians since the mid-60s, most of them are nothing but MK ultra mind-controlled politicians anyway. Some of them are what you call robotoids. All right. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's a cyborg. Some people might say, oh, well, come on now you're going too far. You can get a book by somebody named Zbigniew Brzezinski, who just died this past Saturday. He's one of the major movers and shakers in foreign policy in the last 50 years. He was a Polish, what they call a geostrategist. He's the one who talked about robotoids and what he called technotronics. All right. He's the one who brought out things about weather modification. But we'll talk about him when I do the video on him. But yeah, Nixon hated Kennedy, and that's why Nixon presided over the group called Operation 40 that had Kennedy killed. All right. Allegedly. All right. Allegedly. Nixon presided over that group, Operation 40, that had him killed, funded by George H.W. Bush. Allegedly. This is how George H.W. Bush became affiliated with the CIA, and later on became the head of the CIA for a short time, because he was a major CIA mover and shaker from the start. In the late 50s, after they had Fulgencio Batista taken out of power in Cuba, they had Castro put in. After they had Castro put in, a lot of the private corporations started to complain because they were losing money. All right, because of the regime that Castro was running. So then they formed Operation 40 to have Castro taken out of power. Richard Nixon was the head of Operation 40. That was under his command, as well as being under the command of Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, all right, allegedly. But they needed funding, so that's where George H.W. Bush came in. He was the oil man. And obviously he also had connections through his dad, and Nazi ties as well, allegedly. All right, but like I said, we'll do that when we get to the Bushes. But allegedly they had Kennedy killed because he didn't do a good enough job getting Castro out of power, right? Who they claimed to have wanted out of power, and they took him out in the late 60s because he wasn't following instructions. Kennedy was a guy who wasn't following instructions. He wanted to bring back the silver standard, and keep the money backed by silver. So they took him out. All right, allegedly. That's what that was about. And now Operation 40 was a bunch of Cuban exiles who had been trained by the CIA to stage coups and execute assassinations. One of the main guys on that Operation 40 was a man named Frank Sturgis, who was a CIA operative, even though they deny it. Right, allegedly, he was CIA operative. And he also was one of the men who was involved with the Watergate break-in. All right. So like I said before, all these things are connected, brothers. All these guys are connected. They're all wicked. Let me let this guy keep talking now.
Types. And he begins to think of himself as the common man, the forgotten American.
Which we heard a lot from.
Forgotten American. Bullshit. That guy was backed by Prescott Bush. Damn Nazi.
From President Trump.
We actually heard forgotten American this week from President Trump.
John, talk to me a little bit about how President Nixon's party reacted to him through the Watergate crisis. Because initially, the conservatives didn't like Richard Nixon.
No, they didn't. And he actually has this little star of his own up in the celestial sky of politics. Because the conservatives have moved on to Reaganism and a more...
Reaganism, another Nazi. Ronald Reagan, for those of y'all who don't know, another Nazi. That's why they teamed him up with Bush. But Bush didn't like Reagan. He wanted him out the way. That's why he had the assassination attempt on him, allegedly. All right. But Ronald Reagan had a lot in his cabinet. He had a lot of former Nazis. All right. And so did this guy, Nixon. All right. He had something called the Berlin Wall. It was Kissinger. It was a guy, I believe, named Ehrlichman. He had two more guys. Was it Borman, something like that? Yeah, but he did. All these guys, brothers, from the mid 40s onward, the country has basically been run according to the SS. All right, the SS, for those of y'all who don't know, were the inner circle of the Nazis. They were known as the Knights of the Black Sun. Okay. They're the ones who determine a lot of the policy in America. Like I said, they brought a lot of these Nazi scientists over here. Operation Paperclip. They said that Nixon and his inner circle, they used to stay in the basement in the White House, and they used to watch old Hitler propaganda films all throughout the night. These guys, they love Hitler, man. Don't let them fool you thinking that they hate Hitler so much. Allegedly. All right. They're sitting there. They sat in the basement. They would watch old Hitler films all day and night. Problem with this guy is that Nixon, they were done with him after a while. They wanted him removed. He was too sloppy. All right. He was always trying to advocate breaking into everything. He tried to have the Brookings Institute broken into, certain media people that he didn't like. He was, he contemplated having them bumped off. G. Gordon Liddy talked about that. This guy was real sloppy. And plus, like I said, he's a pedophile, allegedly. All right. All up in the Bohemian Grove, sacrificing children, allegedly.
Right-wing stance, and liberals will never like Richard Nixon, so he sort of floats around by himself. But his party stuck with him right till the very end, till we had what was known as the smoking gun tape came out in the end of as the result of a Supreme Court decision in July 1974. And then Barry Goldwater and Hugh Scott and John Rhodes went up to the White House, and they met with him, and they said, we don't have the votes to stop impeachment in the House, and you're going to get convicted in the Senate. And that's when he decided to leave.
And what?
Yeah, but he knew he was going to get removed. That's when they brought in Gerald Ford, that member of the Council of Foreign Relations, Gerald Ford. And you know who they made vice president under Gerald Ford, right? Nelson Rockefeller. Right? Because Nelson Rockefeller always wanted to be president. Nelson Rockefeller, the same guy who used up Jackie Robinson. Right? For those of you guys who don't know, when you watch that video on Jackie Robinson that I did, the Caucasian man who's with him, that's Nelson Rockefeller. All right. Now, interestingly enough, when Richard Nixon, he ran for governor, I believe was it governor or a congressman in 1962 for California when he lost. He just decided after he lost, he tried to act like he didn't want to be in politics anymore. He moved to New York. He practiced law, and he moved into a building that was owned by Nelson Rockefeller. Why is that? Because he was a pawn of the Rockefellers, right? The Rockefellers were linked with the Bushes, right? Prescott Bush took Nixon under his wing. That's why Nixon knew that when he needed money to fund Operation 40, he went to George H.W. Bush, right? It's all interrelated, brothers. All right. The Bushes helped fund the Nazis. When Nixon came into power, a lot of his cabinet, former Nazis, SS. All right. But anyway, let's continue on. Let's see what this guy's talking about. And Henry Kissinger. Brothers, this is why I talk about the things that I talk about. Henry Kissinger presided over a program called MK Naomi. For those of you brothers who don't know, MK Naomi is a depopulation program, all right, centered around people of color. Then they created diseases like the Ebola virus, all right. They took AIDS, the AIDS virus, which they had been working on since the late 1800s, believe it or not. I'll probably do a video on that, and they streamlined it. All right, Henry Kissinger, he's an advocate of population control. And when they talk about population control, they're talking about killing all people of color. That's what they're talking about. But let's continue on. I'm here trying to remember all the things that I've read about Richard Nixon over the years, because there's so much on this guy. It's crazy.
And what of Nixon's relationship to his staff? Donald Trump, this week it was revealed that he had been having conversations directly with Michael Flynn, even though he was under investigation. Donald Trump had a conversation with H.R. Haldeman. It sounds like there were similar parallels.
Richard Nixon had a conversation. Yeah.
That's another one of them guys that was in his cabinet, Haldeman. I'm glad the chick brought that up. But yeah, Nixon, he knew the writing was on the wall for them to remove him. So he tried to get as many people on his staff that were not members of the CFR as possible. But he had a couple that were. Two of them being Alexander Haig. For those of you guys who don't know who Alexander Haig was, he was a guy who came through the military in the mid-'60s. And then he became a part of Nixon's staff. And he also later on was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, if I remember correctly. Him and, of course, Henry Kissinger, who's Henry Kissinger, for those of you who don't know, is like a quadruple agent. All right. I mentioned this in a previous video. The former son of the last Tsar of Russia, when Russia was, when you had the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Tsars were taken out of power. Tsar Nicholas II, if I remember correctly. His son was a hemophiliac. I can't remember his name. I think it was Alexander. They thought that his son was killed. They realized, that his son was not killed. His son was ferried out of Russia, I believe by Woodrow Wilson, under the orders of Woodrow Wilson, and he was put in protective custody. He ended up growing up to become a bigwig in the Polish. The name he took was Michael Golanowski. So Michael Golanowski stated, when they were testing him to see if he actually was the son of the Tsar, he dropped a lot of dimes on people. One of the dimes that he dropped was that Henry Kissinger was an agent of the KGB. All right. So these guys, they're all watching each other, and they all are double and triple agents. Just like one of the guys in Operation 40 that I mentioned, Frank Sturgis. This guy goes and he joins the military. He goes and fights in World War II, at a young age, and then he becomes a double agent working with the CIA. They deny that he works for the CIA. He helped take Fulgencio Batista out of power to put in Castro. Then he goes and he joins Operation 40 to help take Castro out of power. That's why these guys in the CIA, they're all, they're number demons, man. Allegedly. All right, they just run around causing confusion all over the earth, staging coups and craziness. All right?
Yeah.
Richard Nixon.
Yeah, Nixon never said anything like this. So this is from this morning's Times. I just fired the head of the FBI. I faced great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. It took Nixon until after he resigned, was on David Frost, to say something that was sort of that incriminating or that kind of a self-indictment.
Now, why would you say some bullshit like that when he was incriminated based on the tapes that they had of him? All right. Nixon said far worse things on them tapes than Trump has said on a microphone so far. Nixon said that blacks are terrible and they won't have a civilization for 500 years and all this other shit that he was talking. All right. Nixon, they had loads and loads of tapes on Nixon. All right. And he was set up by Alexander Haig and Kissinger. They wanted dirt on him. That's why they made Spiro Agnew his vice president, because they already had dirt on Spiro Agnew if they needed to remove him.
So this whole thing has been compressed into 120 days. We've had cover-up, tape, impeachment, all of the massacre in the last week. I mean, it's
a speeded-up version.
Yeah.
John Farrell, thank you so much for being with us. Richard Nixon, The Life. The book is available now. It's a fascinating read.
It's a fascinating read. It's a fascinating bunch of bullshit, probably. But yeah, Richard Nixon, man. I mean, you guys get a chance, read up on that guy. He was all over the place. He was a big demon. All right, that's what he was, and he was a pawn of the Bushes. When they were done with him, they just scooped his ass up and moved him out of the way. All right, that's why they staged that so-called Watergate. I mean, when you read about Watergate, they tell you that it was led by a guy named James McCord, G. Gordon Liddy. And come to find out, James McCord was a CIA operative. That whole thing was set up to incriminate Nixon. Right. Kissinger brainchild the whole thing. Supposedly they were trying to go in there and get information on the Democratic nominee and all this silliness. Now, Nixon was an advocate of break-ins, like I stated in the past, like I stated in the video, earlier in the video. He wanted them to break into the Brookings Institute for something. I can't remember what reason it was, but he wanted them to break into the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank over there in D.C. But this break-in at Watergate, allegedly he knew nothing about. All right. And this guy, Deep Throat, they claimed it at first. They claimed it was Alexander Haig, and then it was Mark Felt. And there's all a bunch of confusion. It's all a show for the American populace. All right. What they really don't tell you about is the things that you guys need to know. Things like him presiding over Operation 40 and George H.W. Bush bankrolling it. And it was because of the expertise that George H.W. Bush had in getting Operation 40, which is basically just a CIA kill squad, get them together. That's what validated him becoming the CIA chief in the late 70s. All right. So the rabbit hole is so deep when you're dealing with these guys, man. And by the way, the photo that I used on, for this video is a picture of Prescott Bush and George Bush. And the third guy in the middle of them is a guy named Jack Rubenstein. And you know him better as Jack Ruby. All right. He's the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald after Lee Harvey Oswald was used as a patsy in the Kennedy assassination. So that shows you that Jack Ruby was connected to the Bushes and to Nixon. That's why, like I said, those are the guys that had Kennedy killed. All right. When I did the Kennedy video, there was guys in the comments. There was some guy in the comments trying to argue with me. Brother, I don't bring out everything on every video. All right. I got to save certain things for here and there. All right. So, yeah, Operation 40, they all that was a CIA kill squad presided over by Nixon, Allen Dulles, the Bushes, and Eisenhower. All right. Like I stated on the Kennedy video, Kennedy was in over his head. All right. All Kennedy knew about MK Ultra was that he can get some chicks that were under programming, mind control programming to do with him whatever he wanted them to do to him. All right. To do to him whatever he wanted them to do to him. He was a sex addict, like I said. All right. That's all that was. But Jack Ruby and the Kennedy assassination, that whole thing was a big cover up. And Jack Ruby worked under Sam Giancana. All right. The mobster. All right. All the mafia was back then was another arm of the CIA. That's all that was. But anyway, long video. If I forgot anything, I apologize. Peace.